And here we are. Last and most definitely not least is Domain 8, Software Development Security. Ugh. Okay, this not these set of videos were definitely a slog through, being I don't really do as much video uploading or creating for the matter yet, but I am starting to get a stride. So with that, here comes Domain 8, and let's get to it. So you know, everything we deal with revolves around one big thing: software. Right? If we didn't have software, we wouldn't have devices, operating systems, all that stuff. Right? So this gets into the security of software design. Um, and you learn some. There's some core concepts are covered in this domain. Not just the code. It's not initially code itself, but things involving how teams of people develop stuff. So with that, let's see. So here's some basic concepts in programming. I'm not going to read through all these. I want to kind of get familiar with the concepts of what machine code is and up to source and similar compilers. I'll have to fill that in before I finish. And then the types of software, of course, you have open source, which is stuff like, oh, I'm not even showing the screen yet. Here we go. Okay. So you have your types of software. So you have closed source. Think it real simple, like things like Microsoft software, where we don't see the source code and it's made inside of behind the curtain, for lack of a better word. That's your closed source. More open source is, say, you're seeing the chef making the stuff. You can make suggestions. This gets more open source, and you might even be making your own variation of a thing of the thing. So basically a lot of things like Linux, Apache, a lot of different stuff out there that is open source. It's at your disposal. That's more widely where you can look into the source code directly and see how it's made from the ground up. Proprietary software, kind of a bit of a gray, but gets into covering the property, intellectual property protections, getting into copyrights and patents. Freeware, that's more or less, it's available, and in most cases it's going to be open source, or at one point was open source and now kind of closed, like say the sysinternal suite. Then you get into the application develop methods. This is just a comparison of agile versus waterfall. I'll fill these in, but before, probably by the time this is uploaded, I'll have those filled in. This is my second video today, so I'm kind of rushing through. The database keys, you're going to get some concepts on that. Get familiar with the differences between a primary and candidate key, foreign key, and you'll be golden. There are some vulnerabilities to cover, such as buffer overflows. Honestly, for some of the stuff, particularly like buffer overflows or explaining some of the stuff with code, I could create whole separate videos on that. In fact, that's what I'll do. Just I don't have a large amount of content planned out in a well structure. So get familiar with your buffer overflows. Talk to that's time of contact, time of use. Basically, where, well, I'll explain that in videos. There's going to be some stuff on cross-site scripting and request forgery. I'll sum that up and say get familiar with the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities, and that'll involve around you'll get a better understanding of. So look at here, your OWASP top 10. It's web application security related, as OWASP stands for the Open Web Application Security Project. And this top 10 list changes from here and from over I think it's 5 years, and they'll update it with the top 10 attacks they've seen. So you'll see, say, cross-site scripting or sensitive data exposure, broken authentication, and they may or may not change over time. Injections, a very common one, so you'll see it on almost every list, more than likely. Now, one thing I wanted to talk about more was the software capability maturity model. I've seen this not just in software, but in other things. So depending on your cycle and where you're at, if you go to it, if you're, and this is a lot of these, as I've done a lot of these videos, this is kind of a message to the people that are starting off in security or looking to start off. You'll come into a company, just like I mentioned with operations, where you're going to be asked to do a lot more responsibility wise and make big decisions. So I've seen the maturity model happen in other things that weren't just a program. It's usually a process, something big, like say incident response or how you handle vulnerability management. And when you first, especially if you're rebuilding up something from the ground up, like you're in a smaller environment that doesn't have tools, or a slightly bigger one that's starting to build itself out and get too big for its britches. When you're in startup mode, especially, you like say less than 1,000 people, and that may vary from one place to another. So take that with a grain of salt. But smaller companies where everything seems very chaotic, it's going to be at what's called the initial phase, where everything's very ad hoc. You're kind of just figuring, you're literally MacGyvering everything. And for those of you who don't understand the reference, you're missing out on a classic '80s show. Basically, a lot of jerry rigging and just, hey, we're gonna make this work with duct tape and what was the other? With duct tape. uh, and then once you get to a point where things are predictable, you start narrowing out all the stuff that's predictable, and that's when you get to a repeatable phase. Like if you're seeing things, you're seeing a certain pattern of events, and or you're trying to get a predictable stage month to month where we're going to do these 3 or 4 things every time. We don't have it defined yet. We're not ironing it out. And once you start getting in the next phase is when you establish consistent results. It's very predictable. It's very predictable, and you can it's kind of a further step of the repeatable phase. The repeatable is just, you just found your first points of things that you can repeat the process over again. Once you get in a more managed phase, that's when you start applying metrics and quantifying what those repeatable results are. So you're doing this, you define define what works. Now you're starting to put numbers behind it. Say, hey, we have this much success here. And the optimizing is that when you're at the highest state, when you're just making minor tweaks to that. You'll see that if you are in an environment where you haven't done something like, say, incident response. It doesn't come up in just software development. Like I said, this comes up in a lot of aspects of, honestly, IT processes, going beyond security, just in general. If you're coming onto an environment, and I've seen this cycle where where a new person comes to a place, security team's building up, or their old team has left and gone to another company, or you're bringing in new software or a new way of doing things. Like, think of the people that reach out to the people that had to stand up a Splunk a SIM or a SOAR, or an endpoint detection tool, or a IDS. The people that have helped stand those up be very valuable in explaining not necessarily the terminology, but what the meat and the bone, the meat behind building that stuff entails. I can keep this one short. As I said, I could do a whole separate topic. I could do a whole separate video on buffer overflows, walking through step by step of what those are. The short version for the exam is it's a very dangerous attack. What ends up happening, especially when it comes to things with user input, you find, if this thing is asking me to enter in a name, if I enter in a name that's longer than 20 characters, the program crashes. Wait a minute. So if it crashes, what else can it do? Okay, what if I send another malformed data in that field or what have you, instead of a username? It's a long line of code that, like, after it crashes, you're kind of controlling what it does in memory. So, and I know I'm butchering the explanation of buffer overflow. In short, you'll find a program crashes. You think beyond the crashing, like, instead of crashing, can I get it to do something else? And you're sending a payload that might include giving yourself backdoor access to a system, or giving yourself more access, or breaking something else. And that's probably the worst explanation of buffer overload you're going to get that doesn't involve video. I know it's a very dry topic, but understanding those couple basic things for the exam, you'll know that you'll be fine. What else can I cover in here? I'll have to fill these things out for the definitions. This wasn't the toughest domain. For oddly enough, this wasn't that tough of a domain for me in terms of the prep and questions. Let me see if I can find. I can't wait till I get to the last of these. But I don't need them anymore. Okay, so out of different domains, on my first time going through the practice material, I'll show you the scores I got for each domains on the practice on the in the practice test book. So back to me camera, and here's what I scored on each of those domains. Yeah, so security operations, I had a bunch of stuff to talk about because I scored highest in that one. Identity access management, I scored the lowest in it, and this is before I started really studying. I did these practice tests first and kind of narrowed down what I should focus on. So I spent a lot more time focusing on identity access management and security assessment and testing than all the other domains. Software dev actually like almost passed on the practice test, so I didn't really spend all that much time, and that's kind of why I did my where I don't have specific books for this topic. Actually, yes, I do. There's already a newer version of this book, but I'd highly recommend this book right here, the Gray Hat Hacking. I think the 5th edition is already available. 4th edition will get you'll be fine with the 4th edition, to be honest, and probably cheaper. The I could mention Art of Exploitation, but for the sake of this exam, it's not gonna help you as much. In fact, even the Gray Hat Hacking one, it'll probably be one of those things that you study afterward or read through afterward. And I wouldn't want to initially mention just the pre-exam stuff. I am all about the stuff you learn after, because you're gonna do most of your learning after the exam. What else would I recommend? Oh, and this is more post-exam learning. I'll leave links in the GitHub page. But the Web Application Hacker's Handbook, a must read. I've definitely had this book for a long time now. Highly recommend that one. That'll help you out a lot further with material after the exam. But for the exam, stick to the practice tests. Get familiar with the terms I mentioned in the GitHub repo. You don't have to you won't have to do any of this stuff. This is not a technical exam. I'm sure you all know through your studies. But definitely be familiar with the terminology. So with that, I'm going to end domain 8, and I have one more surprise video coming up because something finally came in the mail. And cheers.